Salutations! My name is Becca and this is Words and Other Malarkey. Welcome to Lessons from My Bookshelf, where I'm reading all the books in my home library and talking about what's good and what's not. So we're continuing this with Sense and Sensibility, which was a video that was supposed to come out last week. But what I learned reading this for, I think, the second time, I may have never actually finished it the first time, is that Jane Austen novels resist being read quickly. It is near physically impossible to read them fast because they're not made for it. They are a leisurely stroll, like the many, many strolls that are taken by characters in Austen's novels. And they are supposed to be enjoyed in, I think, smaller quantities, or at least at one's leisure, especially because these were written in a time and probably for an audience that had a lot of free time on their hands. So I had to come to terms with kind of a hard truth, because I love Jane Austen novels and Pride and Prejudice is one of my all-time favorites, but they're kind of boring. Especially, I think, for those that don't like these kinds of books, but even for someone who does, I had to face up to the fact that these just sometimes move so slow, and a lot of that is because of me being a 21st century digital girl and having a short attention span like all of us do, or most of us. Maybe some of you have longer ones. Kudos to you. I tip my proverbial hat to you if you have the patience to read really big, dense books. This one isn't even that big, and I mean, it is like small print, paperback, Signet Classic, got it for 50 cents at Bull Moose. This isn't even that long, but it is very dense. I kept describing it as like a pound cake. Like literally, it took me an hour to get through 20 pages. I timed it, and that was me reading it like my normal pace, but like the language is like so rich and also just dense, and Austen writes in such a way, and don't get me wrong, Austen is a great writer and I love her writing. She does some things extremely well, and writers can learn a lot from reading her writing, especially if you write in like the romance genre, historical fiction, but geez, it's just so long-winded, and like the paragraph long sentences, by the end of the paragraph you forgot what the subject of the sentence was. I had to go back sometimes, and then sometimes just realize, okay, this sentence really isn't all that important to my understanding of the book, so I'm just going to move on with a half-baked understanding. So that's just how it is reading these, and it doesn't mean you can't enjoy them. Listen, boring doesn't always equal bad, okay? There's a lot of boring things in this world that are actually good. You know what? One of the main characters in this, one of the male protagonists, Colonel Brandon, is described as boring, and he's not bad. So there you go. Parallels between truth and fiction. Boring can still equal good. I will actually make that a thing that I say. So here's what you need to know about Sense and Sensibility. It was published in 1811, anonymously actually, and there was a review that came out a year later, wherein, according to Wikipedia, whom I trust, the reviewer said it had a highly pleasing plot in which the whole is just long enough to interest the reader without fatiguing. This book takes a lot of mental energy, at least for me, because I have a monkey brain, and all of my mental energy was expended in my 4 years of college as an English major. So all of my ability to critically analyze and to read dense, lengthy texts, that's gone. I have, I think, a lower IQ than when I started college. So that's what a higher education will do to you, kids. So stay out of school. I'm really only interested in the superficial here, guys. Like I just said, I am done with that whole mess of looking at the different subtexts and whatnot. Freaking. Okay, anyways. So first, let me just go through the plot real quick. And it's about this family, the Dashwoods, mother, 3 daughters. The youngest daughter doesn't really matter. She's too young. The ones you care about are Eleanor and Marianne, who are like 19 and 17. And they are like opposite sides of the emotional spectrum. Like Eleanor is like super reserved and in control of her feelings, doesn't really like show a lot of emotion. Marianne is like wears her heart on her sleeve, is super expressive, and so that's where the title Sense and Sensibility comes from. Sense being what Eleanor has and sensibility being what Marianne has. In excess for both of them, we'll get to that later because it's really only ever considered a bad thing when Marianne is too sensibilital. Oh my god, what did I just say? So okay, for the time being, here's what you need to know is the father dies and their half brother gets everything because that's how things worked back then. And their brother is a prick, selfish asshole, and so is his wife, who convinces him to not give them anything. So they have to move out of their home because their home now belongs to their half brother. Before that happens though, their half brother's wife has a brother that comes and visits named Edward, and he is awesome, and him and Eleanor hit it off like right away. And he's kind of shy and awkward, but like super duper sweet, and Eleanor's really into him, and she's not really sure how he feels about her, but like she suspects that he feels the same way, like just the way that he like talks to her and stuff. Anyways, so he leaves, and then they move into a cottage that is like leased to them by a distant cousin of their mother, who is this really cool guy named Sir John Middleton. And the Middletons are like become their like main connection to society. They're kind of loud and obnoxious, and like you get like all these like perceptions of people through the eyes of Eleanor and sometimes Marianne, and Marianne is way less forgiving of their like loudness than Eleanor is, but like they are just kind of like really like polite and proper, so like they don't have like a high tolerance for like rowdiness, but like they still are like throughout the course of the story actually they come to really appreciate them, especially Sir John's mother-in-law, Mrs. Jennings, who is just like a gossipy yenta basically, who's always a matchmaking, and she does it with Eleanor and Marianne, especially when a family friend comes to visit the Middletons named Colonel Brandon. Colonel Brandon is 35, which is very important to know because he almost instantly falls in love with Marianne, who's 17. We're going to talk about the implications of that later. And Mrs. Jennings catches on to that right away and pesters everybody about it, and it's funny. But Marianne's just like, ew, he's too old. And I mean, like, can you blame her? She's 17. Even though, like, nowadays, like, all sorts of 17-year-olds are infatuated with, well, actors of that age because they're hot. Colonel Brandon is, like, I guess okay looking, but, like, he just kind of acts old and is kind of boring is basically their perception of him. Flannel waistcoats are apparently an old person thing, and he wears those. Also, you know, back then people only lived to be like 45 anyway, so you know, he's way past the prime of his life. Alright, so there's Colonel Brandon, and then Marianne meets this dashing, handsome young man named Willoughby, who's like 25. That's considerably better than 35. And she instantly falls in love with him, and they are just like two peas in a pod, and they're together all the time and acting like way too like indecent for Eleanor's taste. Like, I don't really know what that means from like a 19th century point of view. I guess they just like giggle a lot. Like, I don't think they're like making out in the room, but like, you know, whatever their equivalent of PDA was, like that's what they did. And Marianne's like doesn't care because she's in love, and she's like, why can't I show my feelings? Like, everybody knows we like each other. So anyways, everybody thinks that Willoughby's gonna propose, and they don't really want to like ask Marianne outright because they're not really like 100% sure. And then Willoughby just up and leaves one day. He like goes to Marianne and is like, hey, I gotta go, nice knowing ya, bye, and basically like breaks up with her with like absolutely nothing to have prompted it, and everybody's like, what the fuck just happened? And that's their exact words, by the way. And Marianne's just like, I don't get it, but I'm not going to give up on my Willoughby because I love him. And so she just is kind of convinced he's going to come back, that like maybe like something really important came up and he just business, whatever that means back then, because it doesn't seem like anybody works. Anyways, so he's off in London. Before that, Colonel Brandon also had to leave abruptly, and they were also like, what the fuck, because they were supposed to go on like this excursion where they go tour a house, because that's all people did back then, was tour houses, and he was supposed to be the one that was able to let them in, and he just like gets a letter and it's like, I gotta go, and they're just like, way to bail on us, bro. So he's gone, and then sometime, I think also before Willoughby leaves, sorry I'm going out of order here, Edward comes and visits the Dashwoods, and Eleanor like notices he's kind of acting weird, like not his usual like open self to her, and is like, I don't know if he likes me, but I still have a thing for him, so like maybe there's just something going on with him and I don't understand it, but I'm just gonna like put that one on the back burner for now. So there's Edward. So everybody's like disappointed and confused, and then Mrs. Jennings offers to let Eleanor and Marianne come with her to London, and so they're like, yeah, sure, why not? And they go to London, and Marianne instantly writes Willoughby, is like, I'm here, come find me, and writes him a letter like every day. He never shows up. He actually does once, and they miss him, you know, and she's like, what's going on? What's wrong? And then they run into him at a party, and he's with another woman, and Marianne's like, Willoughby, and Willoughby's like, hi, and they're all like, so what's with you not like answering my letters? He's like, I gotta go. So Marianne's like really upset and writes him a strongly worded letter that's basically like, what the fuck was that? And he responds with a very like cold and like mean-hearted letter that's basically like, yeah, I basically never liked you that much anyway, here's all your letters back, have a nice life. So she is just like destroyed, you know. She's 17, first time in love, thought she was gonna marry the guy, but was never actually engaged to him, is what is revealed. So she's like just a wreck. You know, if you remember being 17, if you've been in love, if you've, you know, gone through a breakup, I mean, you know, she's like on the extreme emotional end of the spectrum, but like it's, yeah, it's pretty bad. Meanwhile, Eleanor, let me back up a minute. Back before they left London, there were these two sisters that came and visited the Middletons, named the Steeles. Lucy, the younger one, reveals to Eleanor, definitely not on purpose, by the way, that she's been secretly engaged to Edward for 4 years, and that they've been keeping it a secret because his mother doesn't approve of the match, but that they've been writing letters to each other this whole time, and she's definitely going to marry him. And Eleanor, like, definitely knows that Lucy is onto her about, like, liking Edward, so she just acts super indifferent. It's like, yes, that's very interesting, and like lets Lucy confide in her, and it's just like super like Mean Girls-esque actually, because Lucy comes off as a very nice person, and she like is a super duper people pleaser. All the other women like in their circles like her, but Eleanor's just like that vapid bitch, but she keeps it together because she's super duper sensible. So they're in London, and the Steeles come to London, and Lucy continues to confide in Eleanor and be like, oh my god, we're totally gonna get married and stuff, and Eleanor's just like, that's great, I'm so happy for you, dying inside. Meanwhile, she's keeping all this to herself because she's trying to help her sister get over Willoughby, who ends up marrying this rich girl, and that's that, and it's really sad, but he marries the girl that he was with at the party, who is like known for having like a fortune. So yeah, that happens. Everybody's miserable and sad, and then Colonel Brandon shows up, and so he's like always around. Once he gets to London, once he's done like finishing whatever like mysterious business he had, he's basically always around the Dashwoods. Not in a creepy way, okay? He's also like a friend of the family. Again, we'll talk about Colonel Brandon later, all right? He's a good guy, I promise. I have nothing against Colonel Brandon. So he shows up, and he tells Eleanor why he had to leave so suddenly back when they were going to take the carriage ride, and it was because he had to tell, like, it's like, okay, just bear with me for a minute, I gotta tell you my whole life story. He'd fallen in love with this woman who was then forced to marry this other guy who was really mean, and so they like get divorced, which is not a thing you did back then. Well, it happened, but like it was, you know, very frowned upon. And so she kind of, it's not really clear. I think she might have ended up a prostitute. In any case, she just has like lovers and has a child out of wedlock, and then he finds her, and she's sick and dies of consumption. It's really sad, and leaves him her 3-year-old daughter. And so he raises her as his own, and this lets people assume that it's his natural daughter to like protect her honor. So like super duper good, noble guy, all right? And like puts her in school, and then like a year ago, she had disappeared. And he's like, that's not good. And the reason he left so quickly is because he'd gotten a letter from her. She turned up, knocked up by Willoughby. So this 25-year-old had seduced this 15-year-old and then left her for dead, basically. Left her and said, I'll be back, and then never came back. Like, you know, went to the liquor store or whatever. It's like, yikes. Really makes a like decent 35-year-old falling in love with a 17-year-old look way better, huh? So yeah, Willoughby's revealed to be like a scoundrel, basically. And he's like, I just thought you should know this. I thought Marianne should know that she doesn't need to like waste any more tears on this guy. He was a piece of shit. So I think Eleanor tells Marianne, there's a lot of information that gets withheld from people throughout the course of this. So like I lose track of what she knows and what she doesn't. All I need to know is that, yeah, that happened. They leave London and they stop at this house, and Marianne gets really sick, like on death's door sick, and they're really worried she's not gonna make it. So guess who shows up at the house? Willoughby, because he heard a little birdie told him that Marianne was dying and he had to come clean before that happened. So he talks to Eleanor. He never talks to Marianne again throughout the course of this story, but he talks to Eleanor and tells her his sad sob story that actually does kind of absolve him a little bit. And like, again, you can debate the morality of Willoughby here. Basically, he's a giant freaking idiot. Like, yeah, he's an idiot. When he first met Marianne, he really had no intentions of marrying her at all. At first, he just wanted to have some fun because he's a rake. But then he actually fell in love with her. So basically, Willoughby's patroness, this like distant relative of his that he's going to inherit the fortune of, finds out about what he did with this 15-year-old and disowns him, and he loses his fortune. There's a lot of disowning that goes on in these books. So now he has no money, and he likes having money. He kind of has an extravagant lifestyle, and he would like to keep it. So he's like, would I rather be poor and happy with Marianne or rich and miserable with this girl that everyone wants me to marry who's super rich? Guess which one this idiot chooses. And like, he really regrets his choice, but at the same time recognizes that like he's just too attached to his way of living to let it go. But he really does feel remorse, and he like genuinely cared for Marianne and feels that he made this huge mistake and made all these terrible decisions just for money. But gosh, dang it, boy. Oh my God. And he's like, I know I can never be right in your eyes again, but does this just make me just a little bit less of an asshole to know that like I really did care for your sister? I'm just a giant idiot and I'm admitting that to you. And Eleanor's like, yeah, yes, yeah. He's like, I still just, I can't let go of your sister. And Eleanor's like, whoa, slow down. Number one, you're married now, so shut up. Number two, she's over you. So I'm sorry, but like, I'll never think you're a villain again, but you're not innocent, buddy. So he goes away, and Marianne gets better, and they go home, and they're kind of just like, well, dating sucks. And then Edward shows up. Now, I think I forgot to mention this, that like the news broke about him and Lucy's engagement, and the mother was not happy, disowned him, he lost his fortune. As soon as he had no money, Lucy decides to jump ship with his younger brother, who's the favorite, and who has all the money now, and Edward's birthright, and gets more forgiveness for marrying a girl that his mother doesn't approve of because he's the favorite. So Edward is free now. And one thing to note is that back then engagements were like as good as marriage. Like it was, you had to have a really good reason to break an engagement. That's why Willoughby never officially proposes to Marianne, and that's why Edward, you know, couldn't break his engagement to Lucy, even though he admits like it was a schoolyard crush. I didn't really know what I was doing. I was young and stupid, and I quickly like lost my affection for her. You know, long distance instance doesn't work. So yes, I love you, Eleanor, will you marry me? And Eleanor is like, God, finally. You know, it's a nice moment because this poor girl has been like just tormented for the whole of the book over this guy that just but he's a good guy, and he just was a young dumb person, yeah. But not as dumb as Willoughby. So they get married, and then Marianne ends up marrying Colonel Brandon after 2 years of seeing how good-hearted he was and how much he did care for her. And we can talk about like the finer points of their relationship in a minute. So it wasn't that she married him like begrudgingly, it was more like she just made the sensible decision, okay, and she ends up falling just as much in love with him as she was with Willoughby, because he is like a genuine guy and he genuinely loved her. So alright, so that's the end of the book. That's where it leaves off, and just gonna talk about a couple things real quick. I'm not gonna go super in depth because my brain is just, yeah, fried, and I'm incapable of intellectual thought anymore. So first, there's the question of whether this story is morally prescriptive. Now, a lot of stories back then were morally prescriptive, and it definitely I think favors sense over sensibility, and here's why. Eleanor is the moral center of the story. She has the smaller character arc. She doesn't really come to a conclusion to be more emotional at the end. She does like come clean to her sister and say like, I have been in a state of misery this whole time. I held it back because you were going through so much. I didn't want to add to your misery with my own. And Marianne's just like, why didn't you tell me? You know, how could you just let yourself just be in torment this whole time while I was off with my bullshit? So I mean, there is a sense of, there are two extremes, and I think the sisters are kind of supposed to represent those extremes, but I think in the end, it's that if you're gonna be one or the other, be like Eleanor. She's kind of the model, especially for this culture and for this time period that it was written, like young ladies especially, but I think men and women both were, you know, expected to be very polite and, you know, reserved about their feelings and to present themselves with decorum. There's a lot of manners and etiquette and all sorts of things going on. This was before the Victorian era. You know, Marianne does realize in the end that she wasn't just that she was emotional. She was also quick to judge. She judged the Middletons. She judged Colonel Brandon, basically just on her own ideals of what people should be like, basically if they're like her. And she realizes just how unfair that was. And she had this, like, you know, this ideal of perfection for a man, and she thought she found that in Willoughby, and she didn't. You know, obviously he wasn't what he seemed, and so she realizes that her standards were too high and they were, you know, a fantasy. And so that's a pretty good like coming of age message, because she is young, and a lot of like teenagers have these like really romantic ideals, and you just kind of have to like face reality. Not that you like settle for less or anything, but you just realize, okay, like this thing that I'm expecting is literally impossible. I need to reevaluate my standards here. So yeah, take what you will from that, but it's not the worst in terms of morally prescriptive, but it does kind of have a, you know, it's not necessarily favoring towards those of us who put their hearts on their sleeves a lot. Alright, so the other thing is Brandon and Marianne's age difference. Now, again, this was at a time that, you know, girls were considered of marrying age around like 15 or 16, alright? Now, they still acknowledge the age gap as being really off, but Colonel Brandon is set up to be such a genuine guy, alright? He's not in it for any other reason than he just fell in love with her. She actually reminds him of like the girl that he used to be in, like that he loved and whose daughter he ended up raising. So his feelings are genuine, and he recognizes like, I'm too old for her, like she's never gonna want to marry me, but like he just cares so much for her. He kind of resigns himself to like whatever role she'll accept him to be. You do kind of feel happy for him in the end when he ends up with Marianne. It kind of wince a little bit, like, but compared to Willoughby, you know, in Austen novels, number one, the villains always have W names, so look out for those. Number two, the worst sin that a man can commit is to defile a virgin with her consent and then leave her for dead, which, okay, honestly though, that is like a really shitty thing to do. So like, these are like total rakes, but at least Pride and Prejudice, he was basically irredeemable. Willoughby is just young and dumb, basically, and out for his own interests. And you hope that it looks like by the end he's learned his lesson, and it's implied that like he like learns to just make the best of the life that he's put himself in. So like, things are kind of okay for Willoughby. I mean, I think Austen wants you to sympathize with him. She doesn't really want you to sympathize necessarily with other W, whose name I can never remember. So, Sense and Sensibility, is it worth reading? I would say yes if you're a fan of Austen. It's probably not like the best Austen novel. Like, I mean, Pride and Prejudice is always, I think, gonna be my favorite, but like, I haven't read any other ones, so I don't really have any other reference to go off of except for Pride and Prejudice. Yeah, it was fun to read. I did enjoy it. I enjoyed the characters, and some of the humor is just great. You know, there's a lot of irony. You gotta appreciate that. There's a lot to learn about characterization and, you know, I guess building a social atmosphere, you know, like, I mean, this is very much like realistic fiction. Nothing in here happens that I think would be unbelievable to anyone in that time period. And you learn a lot about like what it was like back then by reading these sorts of books. So, you know, especially if you're interested in like historical fiction, I mean, definitely always read like things from that time period. You'll get such a good idea of what people were like, you know, what the customs were, you know, whatever region you're writing about, etc. So yeah, you know, Sense and Sensibility. Will I read it again? Probably not. I think once is enough, but still worth it. Okay, next time I'm reading a weird one. It's underneath this candle because aesthetic. And it's called 16, and it's a collection of short stories written by young adult authors from like the 80s. So we're gonna read about teenagers in the 80s, I suppose. I don't know why I own this. I think I got it at a secondhand store, and I thought it was gonna be interesting. I've read like a couple stories in here. Yeah, that's what we're gonna do. So I think we'll learn something. But until then, stay sensible and sensibilital. Yeah, and keep it weird. So yeah. Yes, I get to take my time.
Yeah. I feel like I need sneaky poo first. It's fine. Yeah.
Oh, we're rolling?
Yeah, we're rolling.
Oh, that's staying in there.